Welcome to another section of the ongoing Kundalini Awakening series. I'm your host, Brent Spirit, and today I'm joined with Jessica Eve. We're going to have a great conversation. Welcome, Jessica. How are you doing today?
Very well.
Great. So, Jessica is a very interesting person that I was connected with recently. And what I found through her work is that she has a very strong and passionate interest in addressing some of the challenges that arise on the spiritual path, particularly to those that arise in the non-dual and Neo-Advaita scene. Now, if you've been following my work, following the series for a little bit, you will have noticed that recently I put out some talks also critiquing the Neo-Advaita scene, particularly addressing why they don't always acknowledge the validity or existence or the importance of the Kundalini phenomena, why they don't always acknowledge the importance of healing, of self-love, of addressing the emotional issues that we have. And after I put out that talk, I was connected with Jessica, and I thought, wow, here's somebody who's speaking my language, who understands exactly what I'm talking about. And so we connected, and I thought you would be perfect to have on the show. So thank you so much for joining me today. We're gonna pick this bone together with the Neo-Advaita scene. We're going to unpack a little bit about Kundalini, its importance, its significance. We're going to talk about self-compassion, talk about healing, talk about community, and the importance of connecting with other people, human beings in the world, in the relative world, as opposed to, transcending it, leaving it all behind, pretending as if, there's no self here, there's no I, there's no me. We're not going to do any of that stuff today. We're going to get right into it, be humans, talk all about the human experience. And hopefully there are some out there that understand what we mean when we're speaking about the issues in Neo-Advaita. And if you're not familiar with that, that's okay too. There's going to be a lot of value here, I'm sure, that you'll be able to get from our conversation. But let's just get right into it here, Jessica. Tell us a little bit about your spiritual history, your background. Take us all the way back to when you were a child. I know that you'd mentioned in another interview that you did that you were having spiritual experiences, sort of meditative experiences. Tell us a little bit about that. Paint a picture for us about some of the challenges you faced along the way, some of the solutions you found, and bring us up to about today, where you are now. And we'll kind of unpack things as we go.
All right, sounds good. So yeah, you brought it back to the early days. So I guess I could describe my earliest experiences as, and there's a woman named Susan Segal, and her book is called Collisions with the Infinite. And I really relate to that because I just from a very young age had these sort of sudden like openings to just the infinite sort of void on either side of birth and death. And it was extremely terrifying for me, and became something that I really avoided for a lot of my life until I later in my 20s sort of started being drawn towards that kind of like beyond again, and discovered non-dual teachings that were really about transcendence, and I think maybe you could say encountering that void or that infinite ground of being, if you will. And it was really, the message was that that's what you are. You're not who you thought you were. You're not a person. You're not a body. You're that infinite expanse. So it was a twist on what I'd been experiencing. Like, oh, that's me. That's my real self. So there was a lot of practices related to dissolution, physicality wise, sense of self wise, and really, I guess, becoming more automatically identified with more of that sort of boundlessness and less of the self, the personality. But the like ideologically, it was very much about I always sort of sum it up as no self, no suffering. This notion of liberation via self-obliteration, where the kind of the solution to everything, or the solution to being human, basically is to destroy the sense of the one who's suffering. So it's very much about self-abandonment and kind of detaching from the goings on of life, which has its pros and cons, of course. But that got to a point where, while I had been, offered one of the most profound sort of feelings of relief and peace, eventually led to just this kind of zombified shell of a person experience with a real kind of deep sense of soul loss, and of apathy and indifference. And the biggest thing being that I really lost the ability to engage in relationships with other people, because I think for me, what I've realized is the big thing about it is that the oneness experience that it offered was sort of this oneness of dissolving. You dissolve the self, you dissolve the other. So you basically kind of cancel out relationship. And so I'd really lost sort of that relationality and that feeling of, there being these rich, robust sort of, distinct individual entities on either side. And so that's when I started recognizing the reality of spiritual bypassing. And it was at a retreat that was called The Great Befriending. And that was Jeff Foster and a guy named Matt Licata, who I really recommend for self-compassion. But they had both come from a similar background of the self-detachment and self-negation, and were now saying, hey, that's misguided and that's unhealthy. What it's really about is self-love and self-befriending. And that was such an utter shock of like, oh my God, that sounds so much more healthy in what it's about. And so that created this sort of massive upswell of just intense grief and emotion around having kind of kicked myself into the trash for so long, and having lost so much of myself, when instead I could have been learning to love myself more. And what happened from there was the moment that I started even just trying to fake it till you make it with a self-compassionate voice, because that wasn't something that I was familiar with. To me, it was like, self-compassion, like what the hell is that? And so the moment that I started creating and cultivating this voice of kindness towards myself, there was just this massive opening of so much of what I know I had repressed during that kind of that phase of trying to simply rise above and dissolve, all of your pain and your suffering and your history. All of that flooded to the surface. And with that came, the most destabilizing period of my life. But the thing about it was that I knew it was showing me that if I wanted to flourish as a person in this life, which I had started to realize is what I wanted to do, that if I wanted to do that free of all the limitations that had been, conditioned into me, that I had to face all of these wounds and all of these things that I thought had disappeared through Neo-Advaita, that were all still there under the surface. So it was like this Pandora's box. And so that had a lot of the physical components, but it really brought me to the preciousness of emotions and of the sacredness of sorrow and of grief and of all of the things that I had kind of been taught I needed to just escape from. So yeah, that brought me into sort of the waters of spiritual crisis and learning about that, really understanding kind of that the period that I think of as Bardo, which is between that death of the old and that emergence of the new, and just how tumultuous that is. And I know with Kundalini, that's often the kind of the experience that's happening.
Right. That's really fascinating. There's so many parallels between our journeys. Even as a child, I had very similar inclinations towards this transcendent sort of dissociative state. Of course, at the time, I couldn't put words to that. I remember experiencing some trauma, and I thought, oh, I'll just escape to the void. I learned this new trick, and that became my safe haven. And so, like you, I think I had a predisposition as I became older in my teens, early 20s, to find within the Neo-Advaita scene, within the non-dual scene, oh, this is perfect. This is exactly what I feel within myself. And
Mhm.
now there's like a whole system and structure. And on top of that, I can use this and become enlightened. And I can, I'm enlightened now. Oh, okay. I was just using this to escape trauma and suffering and
Right.
pain of the body. And now I'm enlightened. Oh, this is
Yes.
cool. Okay.
It's cherry on top. Mm.
Right, right. And so very similar to you, at a certain point, my relational my relationships were just very like dry and empty and superficial. And I
Right.
was deep down longing for real connection. But then I gaslit myself, told myself, oh, that's ego. That's ego's
Yeah,
desire and attachment to other people. And I need to maybe just further dissolve my ego because I'm not yet fully in
exactly.
the non-dual pure awareness state. Right.
Yeah,
Did you have a similar experience like that where things were coming up, but then you used your spirituality against yourself?
definitely. What you mentioned that really resonates is there was this conflict with me. There was this notion that I was following from different people online that I was trying to understand things from, that were basically approaching meeting all of the wounding and the trauma as a means to an end to the final death of the ego. So the idea was that the reason why your ego is not fully dying is because there's all this stuff that keeps pulling you back into the sense of self. So the more you can meet all of that and dissolve it all, the sooner you can be, totally free from ego. So that was very confusing for me, and sort of like that pull, because the other voice was saying that this is an invitation back to embracing the ego and being able to live more free and to flourish more with a healthier ego, and being able to really like more consciously create yourself in your life. So I completely relate to what you're saying.
Right, right. There's a great teacher I love, Matt Kahn, and the way he describes it is that we want to have an integrated ego.
Yeah.
When we're in suffering, we have an inflamed ego. So it's almost like it's protruding, it's red, it's swollen. We want to get rid of the inflammation so that it's a little bit more flush with the rest of our system, you could say, as opposed to this protrusion. But it doesn't mean dissolve it completely. It's addressing the inflammation around it, right? And like you mentioned, that comes with self-care, self-love, befriending ourselves, befriending the ego, right? If you have some sort of wound or some sort of inflamed part of your body, you befriend it, you treat it with care, with love,
Right.
right? You don't cut it out of your body per se, right?
Right.
I really love the words that you used where you said the sacredness of emotions, the sacred. I think you said the preciousness as well.
Yeah.
And that is so far on the other spectrum compared to the way that sometimes emotions are described within um, spiritual circles. Emotions are the ego, they're a problem, they're signs of lower consciousness, lower vibration. And here you
Right.
are saying that they're precious. And I completely relate with that. I have so much respect and honor for my emotional system, especially as I develop even as a man in this world where
Yeah.
emotions are, um, looked upon as something weak. But I really love that you said that. And with the Kundalini process, that's what I recognized as well. This is
Yeah.
this human experience is so dynamic. It's like a full
Mhm.
spectrum. All the emotions are there, and all of them are sacred, not just bliss, not just peace, not just joy. All are sacred, grief as well. And I'm just curious, you mentioned that once you sort of recognize this need to befriend yourself, your emotional system, your spirit, your soul, you could say, all of it came flooding to the forefront, all of the emotional things. This seems to me to be synonymous with the Kundalini experience, right? Things come flooding up to the surface to be addressed. So how did
Right.
you manage the flood that came up? I know you touched upon it briefly, but were there any particular attitudes or practices that you found were useful for you to address these emotions?
Yeah, it's a good question. I mean, it was really fucking hard, especially, dealing with this kind of tear between wanting to repress them and wanting to allow them to come out so that I could, again, heal them. So I think for me, one of the biggest things was about release, because in Neo-Advaita and a lot of the non-dual teachings that are very much about kind of like, treat what's coming up with just neutrality, or just try to dissolve it into the awareness or whatever. Sorry about that. That this was really me needing to release all that had been sort of covered over beneath the floorboards, thinking it was gone. And so realizing how much almost like emotional responses to life throughout those years of Neo-Advaita that I had just kind of pushed down or covered over. And all of that was coming up. And I was realizing the need to release that. And so what I really found, what I discovered, was dance and movement. So instead of like seated stillness meditation, I really found a great help in movement. So ecstatic dance, I don't know if it's something that you're familiar with, stuff like that, where it was just really about just moving your body and getting stuff flowing and moving with it and honoring it in that way, was so different from what I was used to with those really, again, like those stillness based types of meditation, that this was more about flowing and release, and bringing things out to the surface and letting them express themselves.
Right. As you say that, I'm reminded of Nataraja, Shiva, in his dancing form, right? He's if you're familiar with that icon, there's
Nope.
It's Shiva, and he's dancing. He's the dancer, right? And there may be many different interpretations of it. I'm maybe not even maybe making up my own interpretation.
Yeah.
But within the yogic system, Shiva, like within the system that I describe in the series here, we speak of Shakti as the relative dynamic force, and then Shiva is the absolute stillness, spaciousness, the void, awareness, consciousness, right? At the top of the crown. But there are depictions of Shiva dancing, right? He's not sitting still in meditation. There are depictions of him is still in meditation. Then there's also depictions of him as a dancer, like how you're describing. There's dancing happening. And so sometimes I look at these icons and I wonder, how have the Neo-Advaita circles interpreted all of these icons? Do they just think these are all just meaningless and misled and incorrect? Why is Shiva dancing? I always wonder, are they interested in looking into some of the meanings behind these sorts of things? Why does the yogic system have so many different gods, so many different depictions of the feminine, for example, Kali, who's fierce, who's angry, right? And still she's revered. Do we say that she's in her ego because she's experiencing anger and rage? Do we say, oh, Kali, you need to transcend this. You need to sit in meditation and find the spacious awareness, find non-duality? No. So I'm just curious about how some of these circles pick and choose things that suit them, right? Because there are non-dual transcendent teachings within all spirituality that speak about what we're talking about here. Leaving the body behind, leaving the world, transcending emotions and finding peace. But that's not the full system. That's a segment of the system, right? And I don't necessarily have a question for you. I'm just ranting. You've got me fired up a little bit here.
Yeah.
But back to the dancing. It's I just put out a recent talk about channeling, and I spoke about dancing itself. And I said that channeling, whether you're doing art, dancing, writing, speaking, whatever it is a much more effective meditation than sitting still and transcending. Excuse me. The reason for that is because it's a meditation that you do as a human being with your body, with your senses, with your experience. And in the case of dancing, like you're saying, it's emotional as well, right? Yeah. So did you find that this brought you back into the body, back into a place where you had a new way to relate with yourself, with your emotions, with your senses? And how does that look like for somebody who isn't necessarily inclined to dance per se? What else can they do to have a similar experience to what you're talking about?
So such a great dual question that you had there. Okay, wait, I'm thinking about the last one now. So let me get back to the first one. Coming back into the body and the senses, like you're just reminding me of something that brings up a lot of emotions. Yay. That one of the things I realized was how difficult it was for me to experience physical, like sensual intimacy, because I'd been so kind of disconnected, and because there wasn't like a full sense of self here who could receive that touch, for example, that was a really huge source of like grief and fear. And so a lot of what I think that I was working with was a bit of like a freeze response, like the freeze and the flight response of leaving the body, disassociating with the body. And so the movement definitely brought me back into my body. But for me, it was it was needing to move and flow rather than that sort of like kind of, just come into the stillness, like we're saying, be sort of like restricted in that way. So it was a lot about coming into the movement of the body and unfreezing it. And then what you asked about how people who aren't into dancing could do some of this. So it's funny because I also wasn't into dancing so much before, I would say. And there were times when I was just so, overcome with painful emotions that like I literally just threw myself around the room. It's like just shake your body, jump up and down, roll around on the floor, hit your bed, whatever you have to do, that it's not about needing to be like a beautiful art form. And I think, I'm not going to endorse Osho in full, but he has some meditations that are dynamic meditations where it's about like, again, like the shaking and the jumping and stuff like that. So you might be able to find some movement type meditations, but in general, I think it's just about just moving and whatever you need to do with your body to get it sort of activated, and doesn't have to be in a group or with music.
Right. Yeah, Osho did have some very fascinating dynamic meditations, which I believe he maybe didn't create, but brought forth because he found that this is what people of our time or that time needed. Sitting still in meditation, not possible for somebody who's fired up on cortisol and caffeine from working 80-hour weeks, right? They need to shake it off, right? And so they need a new adaptive way to meditate and to address their evolution and consciousness. What you're describing here is in line with the Kundalini phenomena known as Kriyas, right? Which are the spontaneous movements of the body that involve perhaps spontaneous vocalizations, spontaneous dancing, spontaneous yoga poses, spontaneous stretching, mudras with the hands. And people experience this to varying degrees. And there are some who just don't know that they're Kriyas. They just say, I just feel like stretching. And so they begin to stretch. And there are some that I'd say, like, I feel so irresistibly called to stretch. I'll do it in front of people in the grocery store, at work. It's just so I'm compelled to do it. And it feels right. It feels like what I need to do. And it's synonymous with what you're saying here, which is when you were, allowing yourself to, I think the words that you used were do what your body needs to do. That's what Kriyas are. Surrendering to the intelligence of the body. So what can you say about the intelligence of the body and its innate knowledge to carry out this healing work, to carry out its own evolution? Do you think that this is something valid?
I think it is. And you're pointing me to reflect on some things that I haven't, which is awesome. I think that what you're saying with the Kriyas, and what I experienced was maybe like Kriya light. Like I had some like twitches and tremors and things like that. And it does seem like there was an intelligence of like the body starting to like unthaw itself. And there's some kind of like profound, unfathomable intelligence around stuff that's stuck, that's like unwinding itself of its own accord. So, a lot of people say like, trust the process. I know that's sort of a complex thing to talk about, but just to answer your question, I do think there has to be some type of intelligence behind it for it to just suddenly start to release these knots and in blockages on its own. And that's why I think it's so terrifying and destabilizing, because it's just doing it on its own. And then you're like, oh, that was the trauma from there that I ignored. Like, that's that disappointment that I never grieved, that you really, yeah, it's really releasing stuff from some type of, yeah, again, wisdom, innate wisdom. Can't
Right.
explain it.
Right. It is rather mysterious, beyond our understanding. I think it transcends our intellect. It's something that we have to surrender to. I like to describe it as the same intelligence that knows how to digest your food. You eat any type of food, your body knows what to do. I don't know anything about enzymes and digestion, but I'm pretty good at it, right?
Yeah.
You know,
True.
in the same way, my body is also able to heal itself if we get out of the way and let it do what it needs to do, in the way that you're describing, right? When you were saying, you know, you're letting the body do what it needs to do because it knows. And that's what I feel is the Kundalini process. It's the intelligence of Shakti. It's the intelligence that has been animating our body this whole time, just emerging to now take us to another level. And I've described it in the past as an evolution, in the same way that the caterpillar evolves into a butterfly, in the same way that a tadpole evolves into a frog.
Yep.
People don't know that, but we also have another stage as well, which is maybe to be a spiritual human being, a divinely inspired human being, a transcendent, but yet fully human being. And many people are, I guess, living as if they're caterpillars, don't know yet that they have access to being a butterfly one day. But the body is trying to take us to this place. The intelligence of the entire universe is trying to bring us there. And it's trying to bring us there together as well. And so that's why I think it's brought us together to have these types of conversations around this, because we support each other in our own evolution. And I know that we were speaking earlier, you mentioned a little bit about collective healing as well, right? So we've been talking so far about individual healing, but can you speak a little bit about your interest and your work in healing the collective in terms of a community, the world, etc.? What does that look like for you? Where's that all going?
Sure. Well, I do want to start with where that started. So at that retreat that I told you about, where it was about befriending rather than abandoning your pain and, you know, your inner wounded parts, that what was happening that had never happened before was, first of all, like this invitation to grieve, but to grieve in public and to grieve with 30 other people grieving. So, you know, it was just happening naturally that people were having all these different epiphanies about repressed things. You know, of course, I was going through this massive, like, oh my God, I've been bypassing, and it's really all about self-compassion, that I was grieving in a way like the loss of my own self. But, you know, it was like naturally holding hands with the person next to me, a lot of like hugging and, you know, looking into each other's eyes, and this warmth and this collective grieving. And I guess I'm just, suddenly this comes to mind, is that, God, I think it's Francis Weller. I don't know if you're familiar with him. And he talks about the wild edge of grief.
No, but that sounds like a really descriptive title. I like that.
Yeah. So the whole idea, and I think it's that book, is that in the past, people, you know, it was more tribal then. People mourning and grief was something that was honored. It wasn't just sort of pushed away, do it behind closed doors, like there's shame in people seeing it. It was something that was done collectively. They were grief circles and things like that. And so that really opened me up to grief being sacred, and to just the power of doing that with other people. So something that that's really become a big part of my spirituality and the way that I face suffering is in tapping into a shared relational, interpersonal, interconnected sort of web or dimension of reality, where whatever I'm facing inside of myself, I can sort of, at least I attempt to, and sometimes succeed in tapping into sort of the universality of that. And then when I have that feeling, there's that sense of I'm not alone in it, and also that it is a natural part of the human condition. But there's then just sort of like this outpouring of compassion for that recognition that, you know, there's thousands or probably millions of people around the world right now sitting with similar feelings. Compassion for them almost brings in compassion for myself, and there's this bigger, you know, holding field of it. And yeah, that's been transformative. So try to connect it to the rest of what you said. What I've been doing, or what I've been working on, is starting up a support group, like a peer support group for people who are specifically going through the challenges of having fallen into a lot of pitfalls in the Neo-Advaita and some of the non-dual scene that's, you know, so impersonal and so depersonalizing, in sort of facing the grief of the loss and the isolation that created, in connecting with other people. Because when you have that sense of, you know, I'm the only one who's going through this, also something is wrong with me, you don't get a sense of validation that there's other people that have been where you have and are where you are. And so there's been a ton of people who've been messaging me that they're, you know, desperate for something like this. And so it feels like a really important thing to do, because I think that healing, we have to go through it alone in many ways, but we also shouldn't have to go through it totally alone. And I think that healing, from my experience now, definitely is, let's say, supercharged and also more meaningful when it's done collectively with other people.
Makes perfect sense. I mean, that's why I was really excited when Kate West had connected us, because I thought, oh, there's somebody else out there who is experiencing the same sort of grief that I've been through. Now, with that said, it's been many years since I was within the non-dual scene. The Kundalini really drew me.
Just curious.
Sorry?
Like how many years roughly was that?
About 8 years ago. That was when I was really in the midst of this self, no suffering. Like you said, your words, really, I really like that. That's about when I was in the midst of it. But
you've come a long way.
Right, but it was still so significant that it's still something that I'm passionate about, you could say. And so when I, like I said, when we were connected, I thought, oh, this is perfect. There's somebody else who speaks this language, because the other sort of reluctance I have about speaking about this is that the people that are caught up in there's no me here, all there is awareness, are very vocal, and they come for you with pitchforks at times.
They do.
Right? You're delusional, you're caught up in phenomena, this is all ego, this is all nonsense that we're talking about, right? And I've had people reach out to me basically telling me that, you know, I'm being misled. Kundalini has taken me to a completely wrong direction.
Humanity.
Right. It's absurd. But back to what you were saying about the collective emotional experiences together, I really feel that we are social beings. Of course, this is nothing new or unheard of. It's just makes the most sense. But for whatever reason, we are inclined to grieve in private and hide it and that sort of thing. And I think that makes it harder to even grieve in private now, because we're shamed to have these experiences in public. That shame stays with us when we go into our room by ourselves. It's not like, well, now I'm free in my room by myself and I can have a full-blown emotional experience. Even in our solitude, we become stifled as well. So it translates over across the board. If you're able to be open with your emotions in the way that you're saying, if you're able to grieve with others, then it makes it so much easier to go into solitude when those times come. Do this work as well. You reminded me of an interesting experience that I had that I think I shut it out a little bit because it was so weird. But I was at like a music festival. It was about a year or so after like some of the initial major Kundalini phenomena that I was experiencing. And we're at this festival and it starts really raining really, really hard. And so a few of us random people just ended up in like one guy's tent just to take shelter. People were very open. And he thought, oh, okay, you know, we're all just hanging out in here. Nobody knows each other really. And then he says, he was like a channel. He was very, very in tune. And he says, you know what, I'm being called to lead a sort of meditation here.
Wow.
And we all just sat in this circle And he just leads us. He just says, just breathe, just breathe. And I became hysterical, just bawling my eyes out. And everybody there was having a certain emotional experience to some degree or another. And I felt so safe in this
Yeah.
community of people that I didn't know. And I was having this
Right.
full emotional release. And when it was sort of things started to die down, everybody lay down and took a nap. And then there was one guy who found blankets and put blankets on each of us.
Yeah.
And he just left. And it was the strangest experience in the bigger picture. If I tell this to an average person, like, what the hell? It is so weird.
Right.
But it was so healing and relieving to know that I can have these emotional experiences in the company of others. And I just wanted to reflect back to what you're saying. It's absolutely true. Like what you're
Yeah.
offering there to give people the space to have these experiences together, so important, so important. And,
Yeah.
and this is what we need. And it contrasts so much all of the spiritual attitudes of emotions, ego, body, relative world, physical world being something in the way of our awakening. No, it's not in the way. Experiencing these things are our awakening.
Exactly.
So thank you so much for that work.
Of course.
Towards the end, I'll get you to speak a little bit about where people can connect with you some more. The links for all of that will be in the description as well, if you're listening and you want to have a look now. So let's talk a little bit about, I'm just curious, do you have a sort of emotional connection with God? Do you have some sort of devotional experience of your spiritual path? It's okay if you don't. I'm just curious if that's a part of your worldview at this point.
Yeah, it really is. That's a big part of it. And what's happened for me is this, let's see if I can explain it, but it's this experience that everything is an expression of what I would call the divine or God. For me, that's a word that I relate to. And instead of that being just what's behind or beneath or beyond form, it is form. It's everything. And so when everything that you look at is that, and you realize that you're an expression of that and you're an expression of that, that there's just been a profound sense of, at times, like, I started using words at times that were devotional and almost like Christian. And I'm like, where is this coming from? Like rapture, and like it feels like, holy union and that sort of thing. So there started to be a feeling of relationship with that. Whereas in the past, it was like, I'm dissolving into that. Now it's like, wait, no, I can actually commune with that. And that has created, such a profound experience of life. And yeah, it's really paradoxical as well, because knowing that everything is one, but then yet there's a relationship it's opened up a whole new world of almost like there's a relationship between something that's also one, but very much a feeling of a devotion and a rapture, and but yeah, like sometimes just like this ecstasy, but there's something very relational about it, to experiencing everything as an expression of God or the divine, in a real sense of also like wanting to care for it, wanting to care for each other and myself as God. And it has felt to me a bit more of a shift from sort of the Eastern paradigms to what I found to be in some Christian mysticism, in Sufism, in Kabbalah, where there's the divine immanence, and where there can be a feeling or a calling of kind of participating in the evolution of God, and having more of that relationship with God, and loving God, because God is even the suffering, has been my experience. That now it's like, I can't tap into this all the time, but I felt that I could bring on self-compassion so much more strongly when I could have this feeling that, this grief is God, this, aching, burning sensation in my heart is also an expression of God, and like wanting to care for that. So yeah, thanks for asking that, because that has been a really big part of my shift.
Wonderful. for me as well.
Yeah.
With Neo-Advaita non-duality, there was a lot of activity in the crown, which had it was very dry, no ecstasy, no bliss, no emotional, nothing dynamic in the way that you just so described. And even
Yeah.
in your description, there was a feeling of excitement and passion coming forth in the way that you're expressing yourself. You could see it in your eyes.
Yeah.
That was all missing in the Neo-Advaita scene.
Yeah, definitely.
And it's very easy for somebody who's stuck in transcendence to say, oh, that's just phenomena and attachment to the body and the ego that is clinging to love or ecstasy. It's fleeting, it's impermanent, and it will bring you suffering when it goes. But if we look at the yogic system, for example, they speak of Sat, Chit, Ananda, right? Ananda means bliss. And bliss
Mm.
isn't felt up here, it's felt here in the body, right? So,
Mm.
can you speak about how important your body is in your spiritual experience of life and your spirituality itself? And contrast that a little bit with how much the body is negated and
Yeah.
discarded within Neo-Advaita non-duality.
Yeah, that's really, really powerful. I mean, I think it does come back again to having the shift into experiencing myself and other people as incarnations of the absolute or the void, whatever, that it's that sense of, yeah, of being like a physical animation of that. And then physicality is actually what, that my body and your body and you and me, that we're not just that we're vessels for that, but that we actually are manifestations of that. And so my body is its body, and so it's like wanting to express that, and the body being so precious. In Kabbalah, there's a term Shekhinah, maybe it's Shekhinah, which is the indwelling of God inside of you. And so I do really feel like, the disembodied path was liberating to its own degree, but it wasn't a fullness, and it wasn't, like you said, it wasn't like a dynamic richness. It wasn't relational. There was a real kind of distancing and dissociation. But now for me, it's like really embodiment. It's really immersion in this down to earth human experience, but that sense that the transcendent is like brought down into the physical, like into the earth, and then wanting to really experience and explore the physicality of that rather than just the emptiness of that.
Right, right. And I've spoken about Shekinah as being to me, Kundalini within the Kabbalic, Kabbalic,
Yeah.
Kabbalah system, right? So it's
Kabbalistic, I
there,
think.
Kabbalistic, yeah, Kabbalistic system, the
Yeah.
indwelling of God, right? So in this series, I speak about how this isn't a yogic thing. Kundalini process is not just Indian, it's not just Hinduism, it's all over
Yeah.
the world, it's universal, and we see it there
Right.
in the way that you're describing.
Yeah.
Hmm. I was going to ask something, but it's left me. Oh, yes. Okay. So I'm curious. Part of the way that I've seen why Neo-Advaita, why the transcendent personhood denying spiritual circles have taken such a grip, I believe that it has to do with the suppression of the feminine. I believe that
Mhm.
has to do with patriarchy.
Yeah.
Do you have any comments about this, any feelings, any reflections about this?
Definitely. I was thinking about it because, I mean, to be honest, I mean, in general, Enlightenment traditions and religions are pretty patriarchal. Um, but especially in the Neo-Advaita scene, it's very populated by middle-aged white men. And there are women in it, but those women have also mostly come from that lineage of men. But what I have thought about in terms of, I mean, I think even renunciation itself is a very male a very male thing. And of course, that men are and boys are conditioned to not show their emotions, and that emotions mean weakness, and boys don't cry. You know what I mean? So that I feel there becomes this real sort of like crusade or conquest against vulnerability, and against sensitivity. And so when you start to look at it from that lens, like I think you really see like kind of like a tragedy that's going on there, right? Is that it's like this almost militant sort of continuation of the conditioning, that says that you shouldn't be vulnerable, that you shouldn't show emotions, and that there's, I think, like a real pain behind that that's not being seen, in that kind of, need to squash or repress what could be flowing freely, but has been taught to you as something that should be suppressed. So I definitely see the male perspective on it, and I think it's a really important theme to be brought to light around the conversations around Neo-Advaita being harmful.
Right. I see it as a young man myself, with trauma, with conditioning, with a body, with pain, with desires that were unfulfilled and whatnot. I saw Neo-Advaita, non-duality, the transcendent spaciousness as a solution, right? The other solution would be to address my issues, but that's scary, right? It's not supported.
Who wants to do that?
Right? Exactly, right? Especially as a man, it was either, okay, I can cry it out, or I can deny and suppress the tears. Which what am I going to choose? Well, I was inclined to transcend and to negate, and to tell myself that all of that is weakness, and this will make me a more masculine man, right? The ultimate masculine man, who's completely stoic, completely neutral, right? Yeah. And so there's a great appeal there for those who, I've heard it described, hate themselves, right? Sure. If you hate yourself, you can change yourself, or you can escape yourself.
Totally.
Right.
Yeah. And you can also, I think, like, it's interesting to see it from the male perspective, where you were like, make me more sort of like of this stoic manly man. For me, it was almost a reaction to my own, and it's not just feminine, of course, right? Like, I'm not downplaying the fact that men have profound sensitivities as well, but it was a real sort of reaction to the pain of being so deeply touched and moved by life, that I always felt that I was, that my emotional sensitivity to life was so, what caused all of my suffering. So here it was sort of offering me this way to be less touched and less moved. So perhaps there is some degree of like repression of what's maybe more natural for a woman, but I think both of us will attest to the fact that there's, that there's female and male within everyone.
For sure. For sure. So that leads me to a question I have for you.
Yeah.
Was there anything useful, beneficial that you got out of those transcendent paradigms, transcendent teachings and perspectives? Was there anything that you've continued to sort of keep in your toolkit at certain times?
Such a good question. Yeah. It's something that I sit with all the time, because in the end it became, the downsides outweighed the benefits, that I've really tried to understand, what can be carried over from it. And I think what I've come to realize for myself is that any of the things that I got from it that I think contribute to long-term well-being, I could have gotten without any of the notions of disidentifying with the ego and re-identifying with, the awareness, or whatever it is, whatever you're going to call it. And so, I mean, the main big things that I think were so, stunning about it was the quieting of the mind. I always had a maniacally frenzied, ongoing monologue mind that drove me insane. The quieting of the mind, and then there was also a sense of, and I think this now is a really problematic message, that everything you need is within you, though it does have all of it's really a double-edged sword, because it really did give me this feeling of, I can source my needs from within. So there was a greater, I'm trying to like pick out what I've carried over now. I think I want to say probably is being able to see your conditioning from a distance, and to be able to recognize that our limitations are constructed. But I would shift the way that it's looked at to say that instead of seeing that it's all a construct, to minimize it and to get rid of it, to be able now to harness that, if you can, to see that because it's all constructed, you can deconstruct it and reconstruct it. So I would say, yeah, that there's that, if it's framed in the right way and done in service of reconstruction in a healthier, better way, that ability to see your conditioning as a malleable construct.
Right. As opposed to just something in the way of the awareness.
Yeah.
There's something there that can be transformed.
Exactly.
Right? And the word is there.
Yeah.
Transformed, right? Form. You want to appreciate the form. As you're describing that, I had this visual, and I think it describes my experience of what I got out of Neo-Advaita, non-duality, that sort of paradigm, which is stuck with me. In the beginning, it was like there was an eyeball above my head watching everything, right? That very transcendent, escapist, very freeing and liberating, watching all the trauma and everything. Now it's like that eyeball is right in the center. Everything is around it. All the phenomena of the world is around it, and it's immersed in it. Maybe that even is, the eyeball is maybe connected to all of that. So there's awareness, but it's not separate from the world, from the phenomena, from the experience. And I can still abide there and be human, but also have a little bit of me that's a little bit spacious. I don't want to say distant, that feels too cold, but a little bit of spaciousness.
You know what? It's really great that you say that, because what I realized when I was recognizing the need to befriend myself and to heal and turn towards what I've been repressing, I realized that I did have a resource. And what I had was that resource of the time. I liked when people refer to it as like the non-dual holding field, that you could have this, this greater space in which to contain all of what's arising and that's painful within that, so that it's there, but you're less threatened by it and more able to hold it. So I think if you do harness that, like you said, that spacious awareness, if you harness it to heal rather than harness it to escape or to get so much distance that it doesn't matter anymore, that can be a huge resource. But it's really a choice of how you use it.
Right. Right. I would argue a little bit. I want to argue with you a little bit here.
Yes, please.
Yes, it is a choice. But in my experience, eventually the body, the pain, the conditioning will draw you in. You can't escape for too long. Eventually something will happen that brings you back into the body. Have you recognized that? Like there's some people who maybe put on a show about how they're so transcendent and nothing phases them. But I think behind closed doors, they're experiencing some sort of hardship.
Oh,
and it's not that they're necessarily choosing to escape. I don't think they have a choice. Something is going to draw them back into the body, back into the world. Often in very painful ways.
Yeah, I think that, just to clarify, what I meant when I said that it's a choice is that, let's say, for example, when I first had an awakening to that spaciousness and that, let's say, ground of being on its own, that there could have been a paradigm that I could have chosen if I knew it existed, where that was something that I could harness and tune into in order to meet suffering, rather than choosing a paradigm that says, dissolve into that so that, you can detach from that stuff. So I just meant that it's more of like, we do have a choice over what we do with it. But 100%, that people, it is just bullshit that people present themselves as just, not experiencing any suffering anymore. I just think it's like, it's a pretense. And yeah, it's complicated, but definitely 100% agree with that kind of like behind closed doors thing. We're all human.
It's really true. And I think it was Scott
Mm.
Killaby, who's a non-dual teacher.
Yeah, I
Great,
know.
great guy. Sometimes I follow his stuff online. And
Mhm.
recently he spoke about how he was, when he, like, maybe like 10 years ago, he was doing the whole non-dual transcendent kind of teaching. And he
Yeah,
he openly admitted that he was putting on a show. He would look at
yeah,
people with these eyes of like,
yeah.
there's nobody here. And like he'd do this
Right.
like gazing thing when he was meeting with
Yep.
people so
I
that they
can't.
can see inside that there's nobody there. But then,
Right.
10 years later, he's putting out really incredible human teachings about healing, about addiction, about addressing
Yeah,
what's in this
exactly.
body. He's speaking openly about this pretense, this facade that goes on
Yeah,
within
yeah,
non-duality. And so that's interesting because we've mentioned a few teachers now. I've been through this sort of trajectory. You've been through this
yeah,
trajectory. Scott
yeah.
Killaby, you mentioned Jeff Foster. There was another guy, Matt something.
Not like Kata.
Yeah. So, and there's handfuls. There's so many of them out
Oh,
there.
of course.
What do you think this is all about then? Why is this an ongoing pattern? Is it part of a larger unfolding trajectory, or do you feel like for whatever reason things kind of lined up for us to kind of all go in the wrong direction together? What do you think this is really about in the big picture? Why so many of us experience this self negation, self escapism, transcendence, and now suddenly we're all fully here, totally living in the heart,
Yeah.
willing to acknowledge the world, embracing it, that sort of thing? What's going on here, do you think?
Yeah, it's a good question. I think about that a lot. It's like that zoomed out view to really understand things more. I mean, I think that the draw towards it is really the way that I think about it is it's sort of like a symptom of what humanity is suffering from the most, which is meaninglessness, it's self-condemnation, it's nihilism, it's inability to turn towards things, a lack of self-compassion, all of that. So of course it's so attractive, right, to the bypass message and the no self no suffering thing. So I think it's really indicative of the sort of psychological crisis that we're going through right now, especially in the West. Like suicide rates are like exponentially increased in the last, I don't know, 5 or so years. Isolation and all of that, and people really not being taught how to face this stuff. So I see it as very similar to any other like avoidance coping mechanisms like drugs, alcohol, whatever else, social media. But it's just that these insta enlightenment things have exploded onto the scene that it's now an option that's really attractive. But I do think if we're going to look at it in an optimistic sort of trajectory, that the fact that these teachings in the West have exploded in the last, I don't know, maybe max like 30, 20 years that Neo-Advaita became really big, that there's a lot of people waking up out of it and seeing very, eventually how it doesn't actually serve healing the things that we're suffering from the most, but actually kind of perpetuating it. Yeah, exactly. That it's maybe taking us through path that is attractive but doesn't serve it, but bringing us, like you said, towards the realization of what can really help. And I think Kundalini is likely part of that. And it sounds like you have a really strong sense of it being Kundalini being like sort of this wise, sort of intuitive, naturally arising thing that's, I think, the thing that's really fascinating is just how much Kundalini is happening now, right? To people that have no idea, they've never heard of it before, that maybe there is something behind it trying to show us like that's not the right way. We have to embrace this. We have to embody. So I think that's a beautiful thing. And hopefully, yeah, that it is taking us ultimately in a positive route.
Right, right. That makes sense. Like you said, it's the ultimate coping mechanism, the ultimate escape. You get to escape everything and say that you're enlightened and,
Yeah.
become a teacher, give yourself a job,
Yeah.
telling people that they don't exist. This is
Right.
amazing,
Read
right?
read the script, right?
Right, right, exactly. And that makes perfect sense why it would become so popular at this time.
Definitely.
And of course, like you mentioned, 20, 30-year window, nobody can maintain that for 10 plus years
No.
consistently. The body, like I was saying earlier, the body is going to call you back. The world suffering is going to call you back into being a human being, or addiction or something is going to crop up because it's unsustainable to be that
Right.
eyeball up here watching yourself, relating with other people. It's not sustainable at all. And I think that's why so many teachers recognize that in the same way that I recognized it. We have to be returned back into the body. We have to befriend this body. It's not sustainable. So maybe
Mhm.
that's why this has been the pattern that we're seeing across the board, when we look at the spiritual scene in the West, at least from a
Yeah.
sort of zoomed out perspective. You can't sustain not being in your body for too long, right?
Yeah, and another thing I just thought of is that a really positive aspect about the transcendence is that we do need to wake up to being more than just the material and more than just the personal self. But because it's so easy to use that transcendent, formless dimension of reality as an avoidance coping mechanism, we get trapped in that. But now that I think, like we're saying, there's really this shift towards, okay, no, we're an expression of that and we're more than this personal form, but we are also that. That there is that real opportunity to bring in the wholeness and to awaken to our awaken to the transcendent, but to bring it into the immanent and the physical, to bring it full circle. And so it's like it's getting you halfway, but then it's stopping there. And that's dangerous and it's incomplete, but what we're looking at now is bringing it full circle. So it is taking us to that opening and that expansion. It just isn't getting you, to the wholeness and the full picture.
Right, right. Well
Mm-hmm.
said. I think that for me, at least, having visceral experiences in the body of a spiritual nature
Yeah.
are what caused me to stop denying the world of experience, the fleeting world of experience. So,
Yeah.
in the same way that you were describing ecstatic bliss and love for God,
Yeah.
if somebody experiences what you're talking about, there's something in them that says, this is not the same as the joy I feel, when watching a TV show. This is something a little different. And I shouldn't dismiss it as being mere fleeting phenomena. I shouldn't dismiss it as something that I'm attached to in my ego. It's something a little different, would you say? So this is what happened to me. I began to experience like love for God in my heart. And no matter what I could do, I couldn't like jujitsu my way out of those experiences with non-dual, blabber, right? Oh, there's no
Yeah.
self,
Yeah.
there's no body, there's no
Yeah.
God, and all that kind of stuff. So do you feel that these direct experiences are necessary for a person to come out of being, caught up in the non-dual thing? Or is there another way that they can sort of find their way out of that?
Um, it's a good question. There's two things that I want to jump on there because the first one is about, let's say, clinging to like a peak experience of that devotional rapture. I think it's interesting to look at the difference between like the blissful kind of rapturous joyfulness that you get from the sort of detached absence of self state in the Neo-Advaita, and then what that's like when it's embodied. For me, what's so different with, for me, my Kundalini and my heart opening awakening is that it's not all light and bliss and joy. It's this really, there was this really different, shocking combination of, I like this word extagony. It's like there's ecstasy, but there's agony, and they're together, and it's bittersweet and it's pain, but there's somehow it's coinciding with the divine, and so it's not just bliss and light. So it can still be considered a peak experience, but there's nothing really escapist about it. So if you are clinging to it, I feel like it's in a way because you want to experience the fullness of your humanity and your aliveness. So there does feel like maybe it's more healthier and hopeful if you do want to have that experience more and more, to hold them both together. And then you said, in terms of people moving away from Neo-Advaita, I do think a big part of it has to do with philosophy, because what the gaslighting, like we're talking about, like there's direct experience, but there's a shitload of concepts that you don't realize you've been kind of conditioned. You know, you've been unconditioned in one way, but you've been reconditioned to see the self as less than. The self is in the way, the self is illusion, you know, the world of form is not real, consciousness is prime, whatever it is, you know, these are metaphysical beliefs. And so what I found is people who do get to a point where they realize that they're going through a process of metamorphosis or self-transformation, or they want to engage with rebirth of self, that you're really, really trapped in this ideological kind of network of beliefs that really prevent you or shame you or kind of stifle you from engaging in that reemergence. So for me, there's been a big need to explore different paradigms of non-duality, to deconstruct this, you know, that this kind of negation-based non-duality is what non-duality is, that instead there's different paradigms of non-duality, like that we're talking about, that experience and understand there to be, you know, no division between the transcendent and the material. And so really there had to be a way for me to understand and get on board with a mental map of the phenomenal world being real and being a real expression of the divine, whatever you're going to call it, because being stuck in that sense of it's all, like you said, it's all an illusion, just really would prevent me from engaging with that process. So being able to come into a new understanding that's still based on oneness, and it's still, you know, mystery, but it's really about the manifest world being one with the, you know, the formlessness, that really was important, to have a new paradigm that's also metaphysical, to help you with the integration, you know, needing to be able to have a mental map of it that frees you from kind of the stranglehold of that map that's like, you know, it's just your ego trying to come back, the prison of me, blah blah blah. So yeah, definitely I think needing to have some type of conceptual framework.
Makes perfect sense. The way that I
Yeah.
look at it is just drop Neo from Advaita. Look at Advaita. Look at the actual Advaita system. It speaks about Kundalini. It speaks about devotion, bliss, ecstasy in the body. Those aspects of yoga, bhakti yoga, they're there. Neo-Advaita is completely removed from bhakti, right?
Sure.
Like there's no devotion there. There's no love for God, ecstasy in the body. So if we look at the actual systems, we can recognize Neo-Advaita is, it's a bootleg version. It's something is missing there, right? And that's why they had to add on that prefix Neo-Advaita, right? So I can see that, yeah, the philosophy itself needs to be revisited, needs to be reconsidered.
Yeah.
Makes perfect sense. Those are beliefs, right? It's just another belief system, you could say,
Right.
masquerading as the ultimate non-belief system.
Right.
Right?
Right.
And
Right.
you get in these
Exactly.
loops, right? It's very hard to get out of these, especially when you're on, you know, Facebook
Mhm.
groups and whatnot, where it's an echo chamber, any echo chamber for any topic, sports, whatever,
Exactly.
politics. But imagine this echo
Yeah.
chamber. You can't reason
Yeah.
it with any of these people. You can't even reason with yourself at this point. It's very, very challenging.
Exactly.
Right.
Yeah.
I
Take,
really,
I think, some people like a lifetime to undo all that.
yeah, maybe multiple lifetimes. I really love the word that you used there, extagony. I think that's just brilliant. And when you were speaking about that, I thought of Jesus on the cross.
Yes.
That is a peak experience, you could say.
Yeah.
It might be difficult for some to grasp that, you know, the dude's dying on the cross or he's crucified,
Right.
but there's something transcendent. There's a sort of very profound experience happening there. I mean, that's why it's such an icon around the world, you know, the
Yeah.
cross. He's in a state of extagony, right? And fully experiencing that pain in the body, fully human as well.
Right. Right.
And I think that might be why it's such an icon, because naturally we
Sure.
see there's something there. There's something there that this guy is experiencing and tapped into that we would like to model. But of course, we tend to just worship. But he's modeling for us something there, that despite what's happening around him, he's still in a state of ecstasy. I
Right.
Do you have anything to comment about that?
Well, I think what that made me think of is just, I don't like the word usefulness, that's kind of cold, but the way that those kinds of states, they don't serve bypass and they don't serve escape. So while yes, they are peak experiences that you might cling to, when you have them, they are really in service of welcoming and in service of including, right? And of being more radically human rather than less human. So I think that they serve us, and these types of peak experiences serve us much more in being able to include the dark and the light together, if you will.
Right. And I've had my own experiences of that with heartbreak, with illness,
Yeah.
where I described it as I describe bliss. You use the word ecstagony with ecstasy. I use the word bliss, and I describe bliss as not being an emotion.
Mm.
I describe it as more of something biological that can exist side by side simultaneously with an emotion.
Yeah.
So I've had blissful periods of depression, like full blown depression, hitting all the symptoms in the DSM-5, whatever. But there's bliss there,
Mm.
ecstatic bliss, like tear jerking bliss. That is like I've taken a drug that's giving me this biological experience, but yet there's the
Yeah.
emotion of bliss. Or when I've been sick, I had food poisoning a couple times,
Yeah.
horrible experiences, but there's this ecstagony that you describe. I feel very, very close to God in these experiences
Right.
because the ego is in a state of such weakness of there's no resistance there. It's just total surrender. I feel very, very close to God. And after having gone through a few of those experiences now, I mean, I say this now when I'm feeling good and everything is going well, but I get a little excited, you know. I get a little excited knowing, oh, okay, I've got COVID. All right, I'm gonna have to sit in my room and ride this out. Okay. I'm gonna have a little experience. This is my sadhana now, right?
Yeah.
There's something I've always kind of been this way. I kind of look for God in difficult experiences, especially, and that's where I've had like some really peak experiences as well, like
Yeah.
mystical experiences in the midst of like the worst sickness, right? Heartbreak, all that kind of stuff. Uh, Exagony, I really like that. I think you should coin that term. I think you should
How
do
do I do
something like
that?
that. Yeah,
I have to get a patent on it.
I don't know, but that's really a great way of describing this experience of fully human, but having that spirituality that is giving you some perks, right? There are
Yeah.
some perks.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, some might be listening to us here and we're kind of trying to bring them out of their transcendent state,
Yeah.
but we're trying to bring you out of the transcendent state into the body where there are perks, right? There's still ecstasy here. Don't worry.
Of
If you
course.
give up that non-dual perspective, you're not going to lose anything. You're going to gain everything, right?
Right.
Yeah,
Right. Yeah. 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 That it's a both and.
right. The both and. So with that, let's talk a little bit about how people can connect with you, what you've
Sure.
got going on. I'll put all the links in the description of the video as well. So
Cool.
where can people connect with you if they would like to maybe be in touch with you, send you an email,
Yeah.
chat? Do you offer any upcoming meetings or anything like that?
Sure. Well, the website is thegloriousbothand.com, and there's a contact form so you can send me a message. I love to hear from everyone. I have a newsletter that's the first one will be coming out soon. So there's also a link there to sign up for that. And yeah, I mean, in terms of groups, I'm right now coordinating the first meetup for a support group, mostly for people who are coming out of that of the Neo-Advaita kind of self-negating, derealizing, depersonalizing type of spirituality, just to connect with one another. But I just, I love to hear from people, and there's a lot of people that want to just chat one-on-one, just casually. And I love doing that as well. If anyone has a personal story that they want to share, that they might want to, have a conversation about or get out there, love hearing about that too. Yeah, also a YouTube channel, The Glorious Both And, that you can also find through my website. So yeah, those are the main ways at the moment.
Great, great. So the Glorious Both And links will be in the description. I'll try and tag your YouTube channel in there as well. If you'd like to connect with Jessica, to find somebody to chat with a little bit about some of the challenges that we've been speaking about today. I think that community, that group meeting that you're planning to put together, I think that's going to be so powerful for so many people to come together and express similar things to what we've been saying here. And I can imagine now, maybe it's not my place, but I can imagine that evolving into something pretty incredible, where no longer are you just addressing people's past issues, but now we're looking forward. What can we heal together? I think that's something pretty exciting that I'd be curious to see how that unfolds for you. I'm just curious, before we go, can you speak a little bit about the glorious both and? I think that's a nice way to sum up what we're talking about today here.
Yeah, I mean, and first of all, I think it was Carl Jung. I've heard a few people use it and then eventually realized that it was him, but it is, so beautiful. But yeah, I mean, that's really what it's been about for me, is going from that either or. Either you can be a self and suffer, or not have a self and suffer, for example, or there's only oneness or there's only separateness. And it's a very divisive non-duality, right? That's very dualistic. But to coming full circle to realize that the spiritual and the material are one, that we are real expressions of the formless, the absolute, etc. And in general, I think what we're suffering, or what creates a whole lot of the problems in the world, is that black and white binary thinking. So the both and is really about being divinely human, like you said before. I think equally human, equally divine. So I feel like that's the full circle, that's the whole package. And that's a direction I hope that we go in collectively, spiritually. Beautiful. And otherwise.
Wonderful, wonderful. Thank you so much, Jessica. It's been an absolute pleasure chatting with you. Yes, I think this has been very healing for me as well, to finally get a lot of this Neo-Advaita resentment out of my system.
Purge. Yeah.
So hopefully I can put this to rest now, and like I said, focus on the future, on what's to come, focus on being fully human, fully divine. Thank you so much for providing the conversation today, providing the context, giving me a lot to reflect on. Hopefully there's people out there that have got a lot of value out of our conversation today. And of course, be in touch with Jessica if you have any stories you'd like to share. I'm sure that she'd love to hear from you. Be sure to check out her links in the description, thegloriousbothand.com. And you can look forward to some more sections of the ongoing Kundalini Awakening series as well. If you have any interesting people like Jessica that you feel would be a great guest on the show, please send me an email and I would love to have them on. Thank you once again, Jessica, for your time. Really appreciate your insight, your wisdom, and I hope that we can keep in touch. Maybe we'll have you on the show again sometime. All right. Thank you. And until next time, much love. Peace.